Imagine, if you will, a flying tank. And no, I'm not talking about that scene from the A-Team, but yes, that was an awesome movie. Check this thing out. The thing that you can see behind me here is the Tetrarch light tank, one of the few tanks in history that had the honor of flying with paratroopers into the battlefield, like some great chunky boy with a gun welded to it. It's just simply beautiful to think about. And this is its story. Now, before we begin, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, anything you can to do to help interact with the video, and put your comments and questions in the comment section below so that we can base our next video off of that. But without further ado, let's get into this. If you go back and look at the interwar period between World War I and World War II, there were many different powers and companies and all kinds of different groups that were experimenting with many different forms of armored vehicles just to try and see what worked. Some of those tanks are rather interesting to look at. But in our case here, after collaborating on the design of a series of British light tanks in the 1930s, you had the Vickers Armstrong Limited Company that decided that they had some better ideas, and in 1937 they set about developing their own private venture light tank. The prototype for this was completed at the end of 1937, and it was known as the Light Tank Mark VII, or Tetrarch, and was then offered to the War Office in 1938, where it was accepted. Now, the Tetrarch overall had a fairly clean design. It only weighed around 7 tons, it used a 4-wheeled Christie-type suspension, and it mounted a 40mm 2-pounder gun. The vehicle was fast. We're talking like 40 miles an hour, which, in the mid-1930s, that is a pretty significant speed. It was, in every sense of the word, a very light tank. Emphasis on light. The entire thing was armored only up to a maximum of 16mm, which is very light. The Tetrarch did have a similar main armament as other contemporary British tank cruisers, such as, the 2-pounder gun with a coaxial 7.92mm Besa machine gun. In addition to that, some versions had the Little John adapter, which would greatly increase the muzzle velocity of the 2-pounder gun. This was fitted to some of the later version of the tanks, but the conversion of this had a tendency to wear out the gun's barrels at a rather uncomfortable rate. And the British were kind of hurting in the way of supply, which was not a good thing to be able to replace parts. Still, that all being said, they thought that this was going to be a pretty good tank that would be able to hold up its own on the battlefield. But unfortunately, just as the first production tanks at the time known as the Purda were beginning to appear in the summer of 1940, the Army was kind of having second thoughts about light tanks as a whole. Because the campaign in France and the disaster that was Dunkirk had shown that light tanks were not really viable units on the battlefield, and the general staff was starting to turn to the use of armored cars for reconnaissance, as these were going to be much cheaper and easier to produce. So production gets halted and they try and figure out what exactly they can do with them, or whether or not there will be a useful thing for them in the first place, when they have a new idea. The idea of using tanks for armored paratroop missions. You see, the Tetrarch was light enough and compact enough that it was hoped that it would be able to provide a viable air-portable tank. Production was restarted in 1941, and a total of 171 Tetrarch tanks were built. Although at one point there was a bit of a delay in its production because the factory that made them kind of got bombed. But in the end, they still got produced, and the last one rolled off the line in 1942. Okay, awesome. So we have flying tanks now. That is a good thing, right? Well, here's the thing. When the tanks were received by the Army wasn't exactly happy with it. It wasn't inherently that they were bad, it was just there was no real outstanding attributes about them. They were considered to be too poorly armed and armored and lacked any kind of specific purpose. There wasn't really any much use for them to go up against enemy armor. The only real benefit that these tanks had was that they were light enough to be flown to the battlefield. But of course, the British couldn't exactly be picky with their limited resources, and in 1942, some Tetrarch tanks were formed into a half squadron and participated in the British invasion of Madagascar. Perhaps, at least there, they would be heavy enough to take out a lemur. A small number of them were also passed on to the Soviet Union, where the Soviets greeted them with a very similar lack of enthusiasm. But all that being said, the bulk of the stocks were still reserved for use in airborne operations. So now, we fast forward to D-Day. During the invasion of France in 1944, the Tetrarch made history when around half a dozen tanks were flown in on Hamilcar transport gliders down into Normandy. These were special variations that were fit with 3-inch howitzers, with the purpose of these tanks being to provide close support for paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division during the battle in order to establish a bridgehead on France. These close support guns were not necessarily something that would be as useful against enemy armor, but could be utilized to take out enemy fortified positions. And so on the 7th of June, 1944, the German 21st Panzer Division attacked the Allied bridgehead with 90 tanks, but by then, the British 3rd Division was ready for them. Their anti-tank guns opened up at 2,000 yards, and around 11 panzers were taken out. The remaining German tanks tried to swing westward in order to find some gap in the enemy lines, and some even managed to reach the sea at Luxembourg, but with the sudden arrival of the Air Landing Brigade with their Tetrarch tanks, the Germans were prevented from further exploiting their attack. So they worked. But really, apart from this one episode, along with the element of surprise, the Tetrarchs really could not be used in any greater sense against enemy armor or other positions. They simply couldn't match up, and instead their role of being the paratroop tank was taken over by the American M22 Locust, which was a tank that was specifically designed for the purpose of being a paratrooper tank, rather than a light tank that was converted into one. The reality was that in the end, although some additional firepower was welcome for airborne troops, these tanks were effectively like papier-mâché against any form of enemy armor, and they could very easily be taken out by light anti-tank infantry equipment. After the war, a small number of Tetrarchs remained in service with the British Army for a short while work continued on the FV-300 air transportable tank project, which itself was cancelled in 1950 because after the war there was no real purpose for having an airborne tank. It just kind of lost all viability or point, which I can only imagine was a relief to the soldiers that had to use the damn thing. You see, glider tanks, while initially a very innovative idea, were simply too light to offer any real support to the troops that they were meant to support. The extreme necessity of its lightness for the purpose of gliding meant that the tank was too light to actually stand up against any kind of enemy firepower. So even at the time that they were being produced, these things were hopelessly outclassed. Anyway, that is the end of today's story. I hope you all enjoyed the episode, and please let me know down in the comment section below what it is that we should do next. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Thank you for your support of this channel, and goodbye, guys.